Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Numbers chapter 1. And we're going to get ready on our little journey that we have. And let me tell you, Numbers is just a fun book. We're going to try to make an interesting class out of the numbering of 12 tribes with names we can't even pronounce. And then we're going to have an interesting little class on where everybody's camping and why. So you look at that and you think, oh my goodness. But we'll go across some stuff I think you'll like as we go through it and see it. Numbers is what we call it in our book. Leviticus. No, our fourth book of the Bible is called Numbers. And that is because the fella who translated the Bible into Latin thought that was a good name for it, because the book begins and ends with the census of all the people in Israel. The very beginning, he starts with the census of the fighting men. At the very end, he has a census of the entire nation. And so if you're looking at the westernized Christianity side, anybody in Europe and anybody with an English Bible or a Spanish Bible, it's going to be the book of Numbers. The Jews called this the book of journeys. And so they had a different way of looking at it, or the book of wilderness is what they called it. Book of wilderness. Other people have called it the book of journeys or the book of complaining or murmurings. And so you have that different names which go there. If you split the book in two, from chapters 1 to 20 is the old generation. And of course, after they rebel against God with the spies, then after 21 to the end of the book is the new generation that rises up. So the book will go in two parts. So let's go ahead and we'll talk about the numbering of the people. And that's what we read of in chapter 1. So imagine, if you will, the logistics needed to do this. The congregation where I first started preaching when I graduated out of college, everybody would eat at a restaurant before church on Wednesday night. And it didn't happen every month, but it happened more than every other month. A child would be left at Danvers. That was the restaurant. And that's because parents would assume that their friends were going to bring their kid with them. And so everybody would have this assumption. And usually about halfway through church, the manager at the restaurant would call the church building and somebody would have to go back and pick up their kid, right? All right, you remember in the book of John, you remember in the Gospels, it's not the book of John. Remember in the Gospels where they left Jesus in the temple and it was 3 days? Remember that? 3 days until they realized the boy was gone? I always thought that was so crazy until I had kids, right? Logistics are hard. Getting everybody to go where they're supposed to, getting everybody to behave the way they're supposed to, that's hard stuff to do. I'm convinced that our preschool teachers and that kindergarten teachers are more effective than drill instructors in the Marines. Because we'll start preschool every year, and the kids come in here and they are crying. The kids are coming in here and they're not used to sharing anything with anybody. And within a week, our teachers have those kids lined up to go eat, lined up to go to the restroom. Those kids know where to sit. Those kids know what the day is. They are drill instructors. They know how to work logistics. So what you see here as we start off in chapter 1 is the logistics that are needed. And it kind of goes with what you see over there in Exodus 18, 24 through 26. Exodus 18 happened right before Mount Sinai. Numbers starts a month after Sinai. Jethro's father-in-law. And Moses has just been in the wilderness for a few months, barely. And he is already burned out. He's burned out because he's trying to judge every single conflict that comes up. He is trying to micromanage every single thing that's happening. And he is just torn up. Jethro comes to see him as they're in the wilderness. And what does Jethro tell Moses? What you're doing is not wise. And what's he say? Yeah, appoint captains over every 1,000, appoint captains over every 100, appoint captains over every 10. And by doing so, you don't have to wear yourself out. You can still be a leader, a visionary, and direct. But don't hand everything off. When there's a difficult case that nobody else can handle, make sure you're available for them to come to you so that you can, by the Spirit of God, be able to handle these things. And so that's the principle that's there. 3 principles of leadership that you learn from Jethro. First of all, teach others. You got to train somebody up to take your place. And you got to train somebody to be able to function to make the leadership program go the way it needs to. Number 2, this one's tough. For me, it's tough. Trust others. Trust people to do their job. You ever have the instance where you don't want to trust other people to do certain things because they won't do it right? And your definition of right is the way that you do it? I run into trouble at home, and this is a funny thing. I run into trouble at home because if anyone else cleans the kitchen, they do not load the dishwasher the way you're supposed to. The plates go on the right-hand side of the bottom side. And nobody else in my home does dishes in that way. Rhonda just shrugs and says, go right ahead. But, you know, I just have to have when I work there in the kitchen, it just has to go where it's supposed to go. Well, when we're that way with leadership, we run into trouble. We've got to learn to trust other people. So, number 1, teach people to rise up after you. There's Joshua, right? Teach people or be able to trust people. That's number 2. And number 3, don't just hand it all off. Be there to handle the tough cases. Be there to handle the hard situations which rise up. Those sort of things that come on. Okay, it's time to take a census. We see that in Numbers 1, verses 2 through 3. Now, let's compare that. You'll read over in 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, David does a census of the people. And when he counts all the people, the Lord gets very angry, and the Lord judges David, and there's a plague upon the people and a plague upon David, and David almost loses his life as well. And that's an interesting thing. In 2 Samuel 24 and other times in the Old Testament, you were not allowed to do a census. And yet, here in Numbers, in the beginning and the end, do a census. In the very beginning of 1 Chronicles, do a census. In the book of Ezra, you do a census. And so we look at it closely and we say, why? Why is it sometimes you're commanded and you're blessed if you do it? And why is it sometimes when you do it, it doesn't go well? Well, Exodus chapter 30, verse 12, God tells Moses when he's talking about doing a census, he says, remember, these are my people. And every person that you judge, we make atonement for. In other words, every person you judge, you're making a payment for. And what he's telling David, and what he'll tell other people who are punished for doing a census, is you got to remember, when you're counting people, these people are not your people. It's not your business how God runs his nation, how God runs his people. But in Numbers, at the beginning and the end, he does call them to do a census. So the question is, why? Why was it important for Israel, especially in the beginning, to know how many fighting people were in the nation? They had to be prepared. When you're about to put an army in the field, you better have your people ready to go fight, right? Yeah, okay. You know, do you have 500 people to fight? Do you have 1 million people to fight? And how are you going to arrange your army if you don't know what the numbers are and you don't know who the leaders are? So leaving Mount Sinai, this happens 1 month after the building of the Tabernacle. Leaving Mount Sinai, they needed to know that they had 603,000 fighting men. Number 2, confidence. God has just taken a rickety old nation or a new nation that's not really sure about everything. Just a few months before, maybe a year before, they were slaves. They weren't in charge of anything. And God is more or less saying, okay, you're a nation and you have got a huge army. God's going to see you through whatever it is you're facing. So this is a confidence building thing which is going on. And so this is what we have happening. So we go through and we start naming each person as we go through. And that's the passage that if a preacher really doesn't like the scripture reader, that's what you make them read, right? Starting there in verse 5, going through verse 16. I'm joking about that. If I ever asked you to read that for scripture, I really do like you. But it's one of those you hope you don't have to read in front of everybody because those names are so tough as you go through. Well, you're counting everybody as you go through. They determine, okay, these are the leaders of each tribe. They're going to go through and count the clans, they'll count the families. We're going to know exactly who's there and everything else. So you have 603,550 men who are age 20 and up. The entire population, we figure, is probably a little bit over 2 million. Last week, we talked about Chicago, numbers around 2.2 million. So that's a lot of people that you're working with, and a lot of logistics would go through just counting these people, much less leading them.
Almost a third of them is black.
Right. Almost a third of them are males who are over the age of 20, ready to go fight. Now, remember in Genesis 46:27, how many people did Jacob bring into the nation of Israel when he counted everybody together? 70, okay? We're looking at somewhere in the range of 400 years. And so we've gone from 70 to 2 million. That is a quick growth. I'm terrible at math, but I read somewhere it's 2.4% growth per year, which is highly robust. But of course, you had the promise from God to Abraham, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 22, that they're going to have a lot of children, more than the stars of the sky, more than the sand on the seashore. And also, remember as you look in the book of Exodus 1, 12 through 16, Pharaoh looks around and says, these people are making a lot of babies. This nation is growing fast. And so he tries to figure out some way for infanticide because he realizes that the rate of growth that they have, they're going to overwhelm Egypt eventually. They are absolutely going to be overrun with everything that's there. And so that's what you see there as they number all the people as they come through. Now we're in chapter 2. So go ahead and turn to chapter 2 of Numbers. And as we're in chapter 2, then you see where we're going to line ourselves up and know exactly where it is we need to go in every situation. One interesting thing as you read through chapter 2, especially if you have an older translation, you're going to read a word, standard. And it's a flag, it's an emblem showing what nation, what family, what clan you belong to. And so that standard is raised, and that's where your people go. And there's a church song about that, right? If you heard the song Marching On, there's a standard. I'm not going to sing, but there's a church song about that, and it's kind of a big deal there. All right. Now, God is teaching an object lesson to the nation of Israel here. What you'll notice is the center of everything is God. If you run back to Exodus 32, and we touched on this last week, Exodus 32, Moses had stayed up on Mount Sinai for several weeks, and nothing was seen of him. There's all this clouds and thunder and rumbling and everything, but nobody saw him. And the people came to Aaron, and they said, build us something. And why did they want something built? They said, we need to see our God. We need to see God. We need to see whether it's the gods of Egypt or whatever else. And so they went back and made a golden calf that matches the gods that they knew of that were in Canaan at the time, and also matches much of the Egyptian gods. They needed something familiar to have that they could look at every day and say, okay, God is there. I recognize God. Now, that was the wrong symbol. And of course, many, many people lost their life because of that, and Israel was punished. But God recognized they need a visual representation of God in their midst. And so the tabernacle is built. And as you run through the book of Exodus, you see that it's really just a fancy tent that looks like a house, really, as it's put together. The walls, the curtains, are more than just your regular curtains. They're over a foot thick. And so we're talking about some massive stuff that goes across there. But the tabernacle's in the center. The Levites protect that inner ring, which is there. And the tribes line up around it. On the east side, Judah. And it also has some minor tribes around it. In the south, Reuben has some minor tribes around it. On the west, Ephraim. And it has some minor tribes. On the south, you'll have Dan. And you'll have some minor tribes as well around that. Now, if we're getting deeper, we could talk about why each tribe is placed there. And if you want to study this a little bit deeper, go to Genesis chapter 49, and it will lead you to where you're wanting to go. And we could spend a whole quarter of classes talking about why they're here and how that goes into their history. But yeah, that would be tough to do, wouldn't it? Who is the firstborn of Jacob? It wasn't Judah. Who was the firstborn of Jacob? Reuben. Okay, Reuben was the firstborn, and he became jealous of his father, slept with his father's wife, which is just gross. And because of that, he lost his place as far as his being the top child who would receive the double portion. All right, so Reuben was taken out. Simeon and Levi are next, and of course they lose their place because of the treachery which they did on the people of Gibeah, and so they're knocked out. And so number 4 child is placed as the firstborn, and that is Judah. And that's the reason the scepter never leaves Judah. David was chosen, Solomon was chosen, and Jesus was chosen out of Judah, right? Now, Joseph was the firstborn of the favorite wife. Remember Rebekah and Leah? Rebekah was the favorite wife, so Joseph was the firstborn on that side. Joseph had 2 sons. There's your double portion of land, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, Joseph's children were half Egyptian. And you'll notice as you run through the entire Old Testament, they're always the ones who are first to leave God. The northern nation of Israel is run by Ephraim and a little bit of Manasseh. And so they're on that other side. And so you see a little bit of reasons why everybody is around there, just very quickly. And of course, you have the Levites who are around doing their thing as well. And so that's where they would go when they were camped. Now, what's on top of the tabernacle by day? Yeah, the cloud of God. And what's over it by night? The fire, okay? So no matter where you are in a camp, you can look and you can see God right there. Now, when it's time to take a road trip, and remember my working title for this is the worst road trip ever. That's what I call Numbers. Whenever it's time for a road trip, the fire is going to move to the front of the camp. And that's when it means it's time to get rolling. Time for us to get going. Now, when we're going on our trip, and that's probably a little bit hard to read, they're headed to the right on my thing, if you look at that. And as you see that, they're led by the ark, which is representative of God. And the priests are carrying the ark as they go along. And then you have Judah and her 2 minors. Then you have some of the priests. And then you have the next nation and some of the minors. And then you have the other priests. And then it goes on as you go down through the Levites. And so God is interspersed. God's people are interspersed through the nation. But they're always following God wherever it is they go. They're following the column of fire or smoke. And the Ark of the Covenant is in the very beginning. God is teaching the people a lesson constantly. He is the center of life. He is the center of everything. And when we're moving, He is the leader of life. He is the one that you always follow. So you got all that going on as you run through and you see all those things working. All right? Okay, now let's go to chapter 3. And as we go to chapter 3, we start talking about Levites, and we start saying, what in the world has happened to me? Now, the 3 times that we're camped in the book of Numbers, at the end of each time, right before we take our road trip, we're going to spend about a chapter or 2 about Levites. So if you're running through the book of Numbers and you read about Levites, it means it's about time to pack your suitcase because we're about to go somewhere. And so what we see here, we just talked about earlier. Whoops, where am I? That's a question that people ask all the time that you don't want to hear. There we are. Is that right? All right. Earlier we talked about the Levites that are around the tabernacle and interspersed. That's what we're going to do right as we look through here. All right. Remember Exodus 4. Moses has just messed up. He is tempestuous, temper sometimes, even though he's meek, he's got a temper. He sees one of his countrymen being hurt, and so he kills the Egyptian and thinks he's going to be a great hero. and nobody likes him, and he goes and spends 40 years in the wilderness. And then there's something burning on a mountain, and like every boy, you get them around fire, they got to come and stare at it, right? And when I was a Boy Scout leader, people are crazy, you just light a fire. Now you got to make sure they don't stick something in the fire and something out of the fire. But you know, that's just something men like to do, is stare in a fire and hope smoke doesn't come. So Moses goes up to check out the fire, and as he gets up there, he's looking at the fire, and just like we talked about Balaam last week, what happens? The fire starts talking to him. Okay? Moses? All right, who are you? Okay? You're going to go and free my people. And he says, we don't even know what your name is. And he says, my name is I am. Okay? Which is strange in our language. What it means in Hebrew is I was, I am, and especially I always will be. It's all three of those together. We, forever in English, called it Jehovah. Some people now say the J didn't exist back then, and so they like the word Yahweh. Y didn't exist back then either, but, you know, it makes people feel better. So Yahweh, if you want to use that word, you can use that word. God's name is Yahweh. God's name is Jehovah. God's name is, in the New Testament, it's going to be Lord, capitalized. Okay? That is God's name. Okay, well, you know, what if I go back and they don't believe me? Well, here's some miracles. Stick your hand in your garment, and it'll come out leprous. Throw your staff down. It'll turn into a serpent, and you pick it back up, and it'll turn back into a staff. And he's like, oh, okay. He says, Lord, I stutter too much. I just can't go. And that's what we're looking at when we get here in chapter 4. Lord, I stutter way too much. And what was God's answer to that? Yeah, here's your brother, Aaron. And Aaron is going to be the spokesman. Aaron is going to listen to you, and his words will be as God. Right there you see the idea of inspiration. When they spoke, it was with God's authority because God's Spirit was in them. Just like in the New Testament, when you read in your Bible, it's like God is speaking to you because God's in the Scriptures, right? 2 Timothy 3, 16 and 17, Hebrews chapter 4, and verse 12. So Aaron is chosen to be the spokesman to the children of Israel. So now that we're out here, you see Levi, and you see where they're chosen in order to be priests. Now, what's interesting in chapter 3, if you take the time to read it, and sometimes it's hard to get through all of it, what's interesting are the two reasons why Levi was chosen. You remember we talked before about the golden calf. When Moses came down the hill and began to chastise the nation of Israel, there was a tribe filled with zeal, and they pulled out their swords, and they killed almost 20,000 fellow Israelites because they were worshiping falsely. What tribe were they from? Levi. And so even though Levi had been kicked out because the way Levi had acted, the tribe of Levi was brought in because of their great zeal in protecting God. If they heard something that wasn't right, they were right on top of it. And when you run through your Bibles, the Levites are serious people. You'll run through the book of Joshua, and you see a guy named Phinehas. And whenever Phinehas gets angry, he tends to chop people up. He is very zealous. Samuel, when Samuel finds out Agag turned against, or Agag was saved by Saul, Samuel, being a Levite, gets out there and chops him up. Ezra, I'm safe from Ezra now, but you may not be. When Ezra found out that people were marrying into the Gentiles, well, how did he bring his people back? You remember? Remember that? It's one of those trivia things. He grabbed them by their hair and dragged them away. Okay? Like I said, I'm safe, you're not. All right? They were very zealous about this stuff. And so God saw that nation and saw just how mean they could be sometimes. And that's why they're surrounding the tabernacle, which is there. Because their job is to be pretty angry. And so that's one of those things that you'll see. And so what you'll see there when we've chosen them, God also has another thing. Every animal that you had, a bull, a goat, a sheep, even a dove or a pigeon, When that bull, when that animal had a child, or a baby, a calf, or whatever you call it, a lamb, you went and you dedicated that to God. It was either sacrificed or it was paid as tax to the Levites. The firstborn of everything was given to God. As you go through chapter 3 of Numbers, God says, I also own your firstborn. I also own your firstborn. That's what we're seeing when we look in Samuel chapter 1, where Hannah says, I am giving my son to the Lord. God says, I own your firstborn. But you're not going to kill your firstborn. You're not going to sell your firstborn. The tribe of Levi is going to represent that firstborn. So when you give your tithe, it's going to the Levites. Your tenth that you bring in each year is going to the Levites to support them because they are your firstborn representatively. It's like kind of like how Jesus represents us on the cross for sin. The tribe of Levi represents their firstborn, and he goes away. Now, being 1/12 of the nation, that's 8%. It's pretty close to where a tithe would be. Now, you'll see people today who will teach in the church that you have to tithe. There's an issue with that because that tithe went to the Levites. We don't have a Levitical tribe that we go to. Your giving is a free will offering. You give to God what you should give to him. Okay? And it should be a large percentage of the money that you bring in because we're blessed more greatly than what the nation of Israel was. And so that's one of those interesting things when you think about the tribe which is there. So Levi was considered to be the firstborn because of the way they were treated. And because of that, because they were given directly to God, they were not given land. And so when you look at your nation of Israel, you have your 12 tribes. Because Joshua receives 2, Ephraim and Manasseh, Levi did not receive tribal land. But they receive 40 cities. They receive the 6 cities of refuge and wherever the tabernacle and later the temple is going to be. That's where they belong. And so what you see there in chapter 3 is God making it clear, working out the logistics of how the Levites are going to be taken care of, why the Levites are here, why the Levites are doing this, and all of those sort of things. Now, notice the zeal that's here. Chapter 3 and verse 10, they're to be around the tabernacle. And what do if somebody breaks the barrier and tries to either go in the tabernacle and touch the tabernacle that's not supposed to be there? Yeah, the Levites are supposed to put them to death. And so this is a pretty serious situation. The Levites are more or less your Navy SEALs, your shock troops, whatever we would call them nowadays, Army Rangers. They are your specialty troops that are pretty fierce whenever they're fighting, and you're going through a lot of these things here. Okay, so you got Moses, and then we look at Aaron, all right? Aaron has 4 kids. Now, we know the first 2 because you went to Bible class. Nadab and Abihu, right? Leviticus chapter 10. Let's go hang out in Leviticus chapter 10 real quick. Nadab and Abihu are offering worship in the tabernacle, and they offer profane fire, which means they're not following the rules. And when they do that, what happens? The fire comes out, burns them up. Aaron's told, don't even have a funeral for your kids because of what they did. They are terrible, terrible. All right? Right. It was pretty serious. All right. Now, in your progressive congregations, if you are familiar with a progressive congregation, or if you go to a progressive congregation, they're going to sit here in Leviticus 10, and they're going to say, no, Nadab and Abihu were not punished for false worship. They were punished because of attitude. And God cares a lot more about attitude than he does about this or that or whatever else. And the way they explain that is they say, keep reading in Leviticus 10, and you'll see that while they were worshiping wrongly, they were also drunk. And so that shows that their attitude was wrong. And so a progressive congregation, looking at Leviticus 10, oftentimes they say, well, this happens because their attitude was not right. And God cares more about attitude than he does about action. All right? So if somebody tells you that, bring them back over to Numbers, which is always a fun place to take them, and put them in chapter 3 and verse 10, and read why Nadab and Abihu were punished. And why were they punished? They worshiped wrongly. Yes, their attitude was wrong and they could be punished for that. But when you don't worship God according to the pattern, God gets upset. God gets angry. Okay? They did not prepare the fire from the altar of incense the way they should. And because of that, they were destroyed. Because of that, that happened. So you got Moses and Aaron. The first two were put to death. And so Eleazar and Ithamar, those are the two sons which come later. And later in the book, when we have extra time, and I'm trying to fill in time, we're going to run through the high priest from this point until the days of Jesus and notice how those two families go back and forth. But that won't happen today. All right. These guys sit, Eleazar and Ithamar and their children hang out at the gate, the entrance of the tabernacle. They're the ones who are offering sacrifices within the tabernacle. They're the ones who are bringing people on out where the high priest goes in the Day of Atonement and all those other things. All right. Now, we go back a generation, okay? Or a couple generations. Levi is the father of the tribe. And when you read there in Genesis chapter 40, he has three sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Shemuel, okay? Now, Shemuel is also called it's Myrna. All right. Kohath is who Moses and Aaron come from. And so through that line, you have the people who are leading the worship in the tabernacle. They and all of their children are going to be leading the worship in the tabernacle. Also the sons of Kohath who did not come, and this is going to be known as Korah to us. We're going to know this later. They're the ones who transport the ark and the furniture. So the guys who are carrying everything on the poles, those are the other sons of Kohath who are not related to Moses and Aaron. That's their job, is they're going to be carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the basin, the altar of incense, all those things is what they are in charge of, packing up and moving. And we'll see later they'll have to cover it with goat skins and all these other things as they get going. Now, you have your people of Gershon, that's the oldest, and their job is to carry the curtains, the fabrics. And you and I would say that's not too hard to carry a curtain. But remember, a lot of these curtains, the outside curtains, are over a foot thick. It's going to be tons and tons. And so here in a little bit, we're going to have an offering from the children of Israel. And we're going to make sure the sons of Gershon and Shimei have wagons and oxen and all that. But they're carrying all the curtains which are there. The thing that blocks off the Holy of Holies, all those things. And then you have the Shemuel people. And they carry the poles and the tent pegs and all the fasteners. And so everybody has a certain section that you're in charge of when you're traveling. God is going through and working through this. Okay, our lessons. I've got 4 here, and then we're going to look at the questions. All right? Every rapper about 15 years ago, more money, more problems. They figured out how to put that in every rap song, it seemed. Okay? Well, we're not rappers, so we're going to say more people, more problems, okay? The more people you have, the harder it is to keep you going in the same direction. And you're going to see that. 2.3 million people, you don't have cell phones, you don't have walkie-talkies, you don't even have smoke signals. God has a plan. And following God's rules allows you to be able to handle this situation. Number 2, God's people are fertile. Okay? Not talking about physically nowadays, but God expects us to grow at a large rate. Book of Acts, 3,000 people. You go a little bit later in Acts. Okay, let me cover the 3 and 4. God's always at the center and the front. Number 4, even the dude carrying the tent pegs, he's got a job, he's needed, he's important. Even if you get picked to carry the tent pegs, you matter because we got to have you to keep this tabernacle working.